Now we're going to go a little bit international for a minute and talk about Brexit, because this is a big year for Brexit. I mean, I don't know if you can remember all the different things that have happened, and we certainly covered a number of the important milestones on the Morgan Streetman show, but the Brexit situation has been going on for over 3 years. If you remember, the British people voted in June of 2016 to exit from the European Union. And that largely was a vote of people who did not live in London and did not live in Scotland, because Scotland is very much in favor of staying with the EU, and also the entire city of London and the outlying suburbs of London is very much in favor of staying with the European Union. But the people in the British countryside and in some of the other cities like Manchester and Birmingham and others, they wanted to leave the European Union. And why did they want to leave? They wanted to leave because they felt like they were being ruled by a bunch of unelected EU bureaucrats. And if you remember, the rules across the EU had to be the same in every country. So what you have is you have a group of bureaucrats in Belgium, kind of like our administrative state here in the United States, who are not elected. These are bureaucrats. They're not elected. They're hired and appointed. A lot of them work in government for their entire lives, and they become experts on how to increase their power in government. But the thing is, the people don't often like the regulations that get put in place. So that happens in Brussels, and it gets applied all across the EU. And the people of Britain wanted to make a change. They wanted to rule themselves, not be ruled by the EU bureaucrats in Brussels. So back in 2016, in June 23rd, they actually voted on the referendum to leave the EU. And since that time, they've been trying to extricate themselves from the EU. They've had a number of deadlines that they were supposed to meet. And if you remember, Prime Minister Theresa May was the leader of the Conservative Party and was Prime Minister of the country and had set up a number of different votes. I think they had 3 separate votes in Parliament on a plan to actually leave the EU, but they could never get it passed, much to the real conservatives' chagrin, because a lot of people really wanted to get this process moving faster. And you have to think that the British people who voted for it have got to be pretty frustrated. But then earlier this year, Prime Minister Theresa May finally stepped down. She couldn't get it done, and she stepped down, and that happened in June 7th of this year. And, of course, that gave rise to an election, and we saw Prime Minister Boris Johnson get elected on the 24th of July of this year. And then things started to happen very quickly. And if you remember, he tried to do what's called proroguing Parliament for 5 weeks for most of September. He wanted to prorogue Parliament. In other words, send Parliament home, kind of like if we could send Congress home in this country. And, it might not be such a bad idea. I'm sure if we could do that, President Trump would be proroguing Congress. But Boris Johnson wanted to prorogue Parliament so that they couldn't continue to enact these various bills to try to stop Brexit from occurring, which was scheduled to occur this time. And I say this time because, remember, they delayed it several times, but it's scheduled to occur this time by no later than October 31st. But if you remember, he couldn't get that through Parliament. He couldn't get it passed because they put some bills on that made him delay it again until January 31st of 2020. So that's the date now that's set in stone. But as part of this whole process, and you also remember he lost a case in front of the UK Supreme Court where they said you can't prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. You could send them home for 5 or 6 days, but you can't do it for 5 weeks. That's not allowed. And so Parliament came back, and boy, were they upset. And Speaker John Bercow was really upset. Now, he's not Speaker anymore, but at the time he was Speaker, and he was really against Brexit and trying to do everything he could do to frustrate Brexit. So they got the extension, and in the meantime, Prime Minister Boris Johnson called an election. And what happened there is the biggest victory for conservatives in the UK since the days of Margaret Thatcher, where they've now got a commanding lead in terms of votes in Parliament. And it seems without doubt now that they will, as Boris Johnson likes to say, get Brexit done. And that will happen early in 2020. Now, one of the things we've got here in the U.S. to look forward to, in my opinion, is a future trade deal with the UK after they get out of the EU and they can negotiate individually with the United States as a trading partner. because there's a lot of business that our two countries can do with each other. And, of course, Boris Johnson's talked about this and President Trump has talked about this. So we have that to look forward to economically in our country. And if you haven't noticed, things are going pretty well for our economy. We're overdue for a cyclical recession. But while President Trump's been in office, things have been going very well. Whether you're on Main Street and you're operating a small business, you've noticed things are actually going very well. And I can tell you that as a small business person myself. But also, if you're invested in Wall Street and the markets, you also have to say that things are going very well. And even liberal Democrats that I talk to have told me, I have to give it to President Trump because I'm looking at the balance on my 401k or my IRA, and it is just unbelievable how well the stocks have done recently. So, a lot of positive things have happened in the economy. And this spins us into some of the trade deals that we want to talk about and see if we can get through some of those. Earlier this year, we had the much anticipated signing was supposed to happen of the U.S. and China trade deal, which the two sides had worked out together over a couple of years. There'd been a lot of negotiations back and forth, and the Chinese had this guy named Liu He, who was the special envoy of Premier Xi Jinping of China. Now, Xi Jinping is the guy who's been elected emperor for life. And we should put quotes around elected, because in China, they don't have elections like we have where you have options. They've got the good old-style communist elections where you just have the one choice, and maybe there's a couple of false choices on there, but don't dare vote for them.
Right.
Because you're
you
going
to
lose
be
your
on record.
You're going to lose your social credit score if you go voting for one of those guys. You better vote for Xi Jinping so he gets a nice big margin and is determined to be emperor for life, which is what he is now. So his self-designated special envoy, Liu He, and their team had worked out a deal with the U.S. Trade Representative Group, including Robert Lighthizer and others, Steve Mnuchin and others, and they had come to a deal, and that was supposed to be set for signing, and everybody was supposed to agree to the final draft of it in late March or early April of this year. But as you remember, that didn't happen. And all of a sudden, the Chinese backed out of the negotiations. They tried to make a lot of last-minute changes, or what we call here in the U.S., they tried to renege on the deal. They tried to make a lot of last-minute changes that totally eviscerated the important parts of the deal. Now, remember, some of the important parts for us are that we don't want the Chinese companies to demand that our companies turn over their valuable intellectual property and innovations in order to produce goods in China. But that's currently the situation of what has to happen, is that if you want to manufacture your goods in China, you've got to give the Chinese companies, which, by the way, when you say Chinese companies, you're talking about the Chinese government in a centrally planned economy where the government funds and manages large companies. You have to turn over your intellectual property to the Chinese government. Now, these are innovations that have been hard gained in America. I mean, we spent a lot of money to make these innovations, both in manufacturing and in technology in all areas. And in order to produce in China, you've got to turn those over. So that's one of the things that President Trump said, this is completely unfair, and we need to change this because this has been going on for too long, where the Chinese have been looting our intellectual property through these rules that they've put in place. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.